Hello, Canada. Something that I think everybody needs to be aware of is Preston Manning is announcing that he wants to do a citizens' inquiry about the COVID response. So, there is a website that is got his information on there. It's called NCI National Citizens Inquiry, and there is a petition there that you need to go complete. Uh, Go check it out, put your name and address and everything else in there, and sign up. So, now he's also got suggest a commissioner, and of course it's another form which isn't really clear here, but what if you actually have someone that's a judge or someone personally that has some credentials. I picked Brian Peckford just for fun. I figure he's biased towards the right side, but I believe that he could be a very good commissioner. And instead of this nonsense that we have with Rowley, that seems to be biased for the government side and not wanting to give the freedom of people like Miller, the our Freedom Convoy representatives to have their way with the government representatives on the board and cross examination. He's constantly getting cut off and oh, you're overtime, not given enough time. So anyway, I suggested Brian Peckford. You are free to suggest whoever you want, but I think Brian Peckford is a pretty good suggestion. Okay, so here is this is spearheaded by Preston Manning, who you might remember headed the Reform Party many moons ago. And I don't know, I think he's a pretty credible guy. And anyway, he ran a little press conference, and we'll just play a little clip here from that.
Who will get to decide who the commissioners are? That would be a lot of power. I mean, I understand that people get to recommend who they'd like, but who's the person who ultimately gets to decide who the...
Well, right now, the organization behind this is this Canada, this National Inquiry Canada, which is this federal not-for-profit corporation with 3 directors, of which I am one. But the hope is to add to this group that will organize this thing so it's broader and more representative than us. But that group will decide. But they'll have to base it on what people themselves say is who would they trust to do this. And at this stage, we don't know what those suggestions will be. At this point, some people have suggested what you want is the most objective people you can get, like a retired judge or somebody. Others have suggested, this is typical of Canada, what you want is expertise on that panel. You want a medical person, you want a civil rights person, you want an economist, and so forth. I think what may end up is a combination of those, probably with a chief commissioner whose main characteristic is objectivity and so forth, but others on that panel that have that expertise. And then, as I said to the earlier question, people will just have to judge, is this a legitimate panel in which they have competence? If they don't, then they won't pay attention to it. If they do, then they will.
This seems a few months back now. You were talking, if I recall correctly, about the need for a citizens' commission in general, about the government, about how our country functions. That And that sort of followed through a few years prior. You were talking about how the country needs a pop-off valve for all the populist anger that is out there right now. And I mean, do you fundamentally think that something is broken in our existing institutions right now, that people no longer have faith?
That's a broader question, but I'd be happy to answer on some other occasion. I don't want, this is not so much connected to that, or this inquiry is an inquiry into one particular response by governments to a particular crisis. I'd be happy on another occasion to get into the broader subject of the need for reform, but I think you've heard me on that subject before. But this is a sort of a narrower inquiry just into the responses to the COVID-19 pandemic.
Hi, Mr. Manning. It's Stephanie Taylor with the Canadian Press.
Yep.
Who are the must-haves in terms of witnesses that would testify at this? I understand it sounds like this is very early stage, we're just putting things together, but if you can't compel people to come and testify or to speak to some of the decisions made at the inquiry, it raises some questions about the process. So in your mind, who would this inquiry have to hear from?
Well, I think the largest group is people who were impacted by these measures. What this public opinion survey shows that 74% of Canadians said they were injured, they were harmed by the health protection measures to cope with COVID-19. So people to testify as to what were those harms, what were the effects on the adverse effects on their health, what were the effects on rights and freedoms, what was the effect on their social well-being, what were the effects on their economic well-being. I would expect a fair amount of the testimony to be from those people, and they'll be subject to cross-examination too, so you don't just take the comments at face value. I think a second type of witness will be scientists and medical people who have an alternative narrative to the one that was put forward by the government. There's a lot of those people. And then the third category, which I think you're getting at, it would be nice to get a response from some of the government people and officials themselves. You can't compel those people to participate, but you can invite them. And it was maybe encouraging the other day that Dr. Tam said that the government would welcome an inquiry into how this was done. So maybe there'll be a more positive response there than we expect.
The federal Conservatives under the new leader have focused a lot on the cost of living, a lot on affordability, some concerns about the ArriveCan app, about the IRGC. But in terms of the effects of COVID mandates and some of the civil rights concerns that people have expressed, they haven't, to my knowledge, been super vocal as of late on those issues. What do you make of that? Should this be something the federal Conservatives take on champion?
Well, we're trying to make this less political, less partisan political than, what does one party think or what does one party do, and partly because of, again, the suspicion from the public. If the government took the initiative on this, if the Liberal government took the initiative, people would say this will be a whitewash. If the opposition gets too militant on it, they say, well, this is a witch hunt. So it's best to keep the parties not directly involved. I mean, they can choose to be or not, but it's best to keep them not. And to hopefully the representation on that website will be cross-partisan, not particularly skewed one way or the other. And again, like we could discuss this academically and theoretically today, at the end of the day, people are going to have to look at these hearings and make a judgment. Is this objective? Was this a worthwhile effort? Or was it skewed one way politically or skewed another way from the standpoint of interest groups?
Hi there, Matthew Hoare from the Western Standard. Good to see you.
Yeah.
You mentioned briefly that there would be talk about adverse reactions to vaccines. I've certainly heard from a lot of Canadians that have experienced that, but there hasn't been much attention given to it. Could you provide more details on what exactly you'd like to see? Would these be individual Canadians harmed by vaccines testifying? Would these be groups on behalf of them? What sort of details can you provide on that?
Well, one thing on this website, one of the background items is that there was a group in Toronto in June that conducted a sort of a test hearing, what would happen if you had public hearings for 3 days. They had 60 different people testify, most of them for 10 minutes, on what the effects were on them. Those testimonies covered quite a range. It wasn't just negative health impacts, it was the rights and freedoms, the social and economic. But the ones that did testify on the health impacts, there were two categories. One was from people that felt that the lengthening of the waiting lines were people suffering from something other than COVID, people that had people die on the waiting lines because of our incapacity of our system to handle a surge in demand, that was a negative health impact as a result of the COVID restrictions. And then others were on the subject of adverse effects from the vaccines. But I would think from what we've seen thus far, those are probably the two types of testimonies with respect to health impacts, and we'll see what they are.
Would you have any Canadians testify who have relatives or friends that passed away from vaccines? There's one gentleman in particular, his son, Sean Hartman, passed away a couple days after getting the vaccine. He got it in order to play hockey, and he's been quite outspoken on social media about that.
These people be entitled to, our intent is not to sort of try to, first of all, to see who is willing to testify on this sort of thing, and about what. But I would expect there would be people that would testify along those lines. And the only caution I give to anybody that wants to testify on this is, A, you'll be asked to affirm that what you're saying is the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, which we never had to take that oath in Parliament, but this is another subject. And secondly, that you will be subject to cross-examination. It won't just be accepted, you'll be asked by somebody that's very knowledgeable about your testimony. But hopefully people with these stories will come forward. They certainly did at this Toronto thing, and the videos of those the hearings are available on this as background material on this website. Yeah.
Me again.
Yeah.
Just a quick question. You mentioned that there were 3 directors of your entity. What are the 2 others? Who are?
They're listed on that website,
Yeah,
but they're Mr. David Ross, who's a chartered accountant in New Brunswick, and also has quite a reputation for ethics in the accounting business, and an Ottawa lawyer here who did the legal work of putting this thing together, Andrei Litvinenko.
Okay.
And the names are on the
Good. I'll
I
check.
think there's
It's
a
just that
brief bio on each of us, yeah.
And the other question I wanted to ask, I don't think we're talking right now of having a real public, like an official public inquiry about this, but if it were to happen, do you think it would be a good replacement of your citizen-led initiative, or do you think that both could live side by side?
Well, I think this citizens one would be a good test case to see what would actually happen if you tried to have this inquiry. If the government were to commission, it'd have the same, skepticism that some of you might express with respect to this one. How objective would it be? Governments investigating themselves, particularly on something like that, would that be objective? Would the public say, no, this thing is skewed? There's a real challenge, no matter who does this, to get credibility, and we feel the starting point for that is to ask people themselves, who would you trust to do this, and go with those recommendations.
So you think the two things
I would think this one would precede. I would think the politicians will watch this one, particularly if it can be done fairly quickly, to see what happens, what comes out, and then that might condition their decision as to whether you have one or not. Yeah.
What do you think you would learn from an inquiry like this? Because a lot of these stories of people's feelings about the pandemic restrictions, feeling about the vaccine, experiences with the combination of thereof, they're already out there. You yourself cited a public opinion survey where people's trust in how the pandemic was handled was low. So what new thing would you learn from allowing this kind of airing of grievances, if you will?
Well, I don't want to prejudge the outcome of this, but if I was one of those commissioners, I would listen to these stories. But the last question I would ask a witness is, okay, what would you recommend as to how this could be done differently so that the harm that you've talked to us about wouldn't have occurred? And to try to get on to not just what went wrong, but what can be done differently. And that might be the most useful outcome from this. Then you will get into some of the suggestions that have been made already. Was it the wisest thing to hand the management of this over to the healthcare bureaucracies? When one of the conclusions from the SARS pandemic was that the bureaucracies are not the right people to handle emergency. Is that so? So what's the alternative? what you might get is some of these alternative narratives from the science and medical community who argue that the idea that there's a single scientific narrative with respect to anything is not scientific. Science involves competing hypotheses. So you might get that kind of output, and that would be useful. It's going beyond just what went wrong and what were the harms, but what can be done to try to manage this stuff better in the future.
Just two other questions for me. Who's going to pay for this?
Well, I wish I knew. We've got a donate button on this website, and hopefully, and we'll say to people, it's all very well to click on here and say you want this hearing, but somebody's got to put up the money. One of the hopes is to get a lot of donations in kind, like just the facilities to hold the hearing in a certain town. Will somebody put that up so that we don't have to pay for it? But that's going to be quite a crucial thing, and at this stage there's this not-for-profit company set up to collect the money and to spend the money, and we'll just have to see whether there's enough financial support to really make it work.
Okay, that brings a bunch of other questions to my head, but you talked about hoping that this would supersede supersede anything that the government might choose to do on its own. Have you gone to the government, anyone in the Liberal government or the opposition parties, and said, what do you think of this? Do you support it? And would you back it?
I haven't, but of course there have been demands from other people or suggesting that this should be done. And so far, at least as I understand it, the government has been pretty cool towards it. And for the obvious reason, this is an investigation into something that they themselves did at a profound level. This is an unprecedented intervention. So I think the impression that's been given so far is that the government is reluctant to have this done, or if it were to do it, it would be skewed in a certain way. Maybe the most recent and most welcome thing was that Dr. Tam did, and some of you I think maybe covered that, her comments. She did say that they would welcome an inquiry. It was quite vague, but so maybe the government would be supportive. I don't know. Okay, have we covered the field? Okay, well, thank you very much. And say, really, that website is the source of ongoing information on this national citizen-led inquiry into the response to COVID-19. So thank you very much.
Okay, so I will put the links in the description. You can see I played most of the whole thing. There's a little bit of on the end and the beginning that I didn't include. Okay, so what I found interesting was his opinion survey that let's see, so as of October 17th, his pool of people were from Maru Voice Panel. I don't know what that is, and it sounds like there are people responding from other countries. We hope that they sectioned out only people in Canada. I don't know where he got the 70% of people saying that they were negatively affected, because this survey doesn't quite show that. So personal impact, and again, you can see this in the website, and it's a downloadable survey draft, opinion survey draft PDF. So people saying 24% were negatively, personally impacted. And then they were asked whether they thought Canadians at large were impacted. And some of these numbers are interesting, where some people, where people thought that they were negatively impacted, and then they thought that the greater whole was either more impacted or less impacted. So, but I don't see any 70%ers here. It's mostly averaging around 20 to 30% on everyone's answers, which is a little bit disappointing, really. And the most disappointing one I'm seeing here is rights and freedoms, that only 12% of people thought that their rights and freedoms were restricted, and that the same people said that, so it almost matched that overall Canada, geez, that's not good. That's got to be way higher. The question, among the 4 categories of negative impact, which was the one you and your family experienced most seriously? Okay, so I guess in rank order, only 12% of people, okay, so only 12% of people ranked their rights and freedoms as being number 1. Okay, so the other 4 categories were health, economic, and social. Okay, so that makes a little more sense. That out of your social impact, economic impact, health impact, and rights and freedoms. Okay, so rights and freedoms was selected by 13% of the population as being their number 1 issue. Not that 13%, only 13% thought that was an issue, that was their number 1 issue. Okay, so that makes a difference. So, and then there's this negative impact on Canadians, that none? That there was no impact? That's disturbing. That, well, it's 27% of people reported that they had no negative impact on all of the pandemic measures. That's bizarre. That must be the whole government employees union. How many people work for the Canadian government or governments right across Canada? Well, it's probably a pretty close number. But the same people, okay, yeah, question number 1. Among the 4 categories of negative impact, okay, well, again, it's across the 4 categories. Which was the one you and your family experienced most seriously? And these ones reported none. And which one negative impact do you think was experienced by the largest number of Canadians? And they said none. Okay, these are the mask-wearing government employees that came out on the streets and screamed at people, truckers and others, saying, "What freedoms have you lost? Tell me, what freedoms have you lost?" And they just didn't have a clue that there were any freedoms lost by anybody. Of course, they were vaccinated, and they didn't experience any freedom restrictions at all, or negative impacts. I don't know, I guess they didn't have any medical problems at the same time. And so seems to be pretty steady across the board at 7, 8, a high of an 11%. in Quebec. So Quebec obviously is the highest one that they've said personal, that they didn't experience personal restrictions? None? Weren't they the most locked down province with curfews and getting arrested and knocked down and dragged out of your house by having more than 6 people at a Christmas dinner, and you could get a ticket for walking your dog? Oh no, the only excuse was for walking your dog outside after curfew. Other than that, you were not allowed outside between, oh geez, I don't know what the hours were, but it was something like 9 or 10 at night until 6 o'clock in the morning or something like that. They were locked down, like on curfew for like 8 hours a day, and yet they have got a survey saying none impact. That's bizarre. They were the most locked down province. That doesn't make any sense to me. The people in Quebec are just like, they don't remember how bad it was. Okay. I don't know. Okay. So anyway, go to Preston Manning. Go to his website there. Suggest you can nominate yourself to be a commissioner or a chair, I guess. Anyway, make sure you at least fill out the form for the initial survey. That's not too difficult, and so I guess you can include as much information as you want there. Anyway, let's get that done and see where this goes. Okay. Have a good night.